Well, protesters in Sacramento, California are demanding justice over the killing of Stephon Clark. Police fatally shot him more than 2 weeks ago in his grandmother's backyard. Officers said they thought he had a gun, but only his cell phone was found at the scene. An independent autopsy shows Sacramento Police shot Clark 8 times. 6 of the wounds were in his back. Joining me now, CNN law enforcement contributor Steve Moore. He's also retired supervisory special agent for the FBI. Also with us, retired Police Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey. She served a 20-year career with the LA Police Department. Thank you, both of you. Good to have you with us. Cheryl, let me start with you. That independent autopsy, as we just laid out, shows that Stephon Clark was hit 8 times, 6 in the back, 1 in the neck, 1 in the thigh. What does that say to you about what happened that night? That
he was not a threat, that the officers were intellectually dishonest when they said they were in fear for their life, and that the officers should have fired 2 rounds, reassessed the threat before they fired any more. And we know that that didn't happen because someone nearly emptied a magazine. 20 rounds were fired. It's excessive, it's outrageous, and there needs to be some accountability for these officers having violated policy, I'm sure.
Steve, before you weigh in, and I want to get your thoughts on the picture you take from that autopsy, I want you to listen to what Benjamin Crump, who's representing the Clark family, had to say about the shots that hit Clark. Take a listen.
Dr. Bennett Amalu, one of the most renowned pathologists, not only in America but in the world, he conducted the independent private autopsy on behalf of the family, and his conclusions completely contradicted the narrative that the police was putting forward, that they had to shoot unarmed Stephon Clark because he was coming at them. Well, all the bullets are from behind, and if the bullets are from behind, then how's he coming at you at the time you had to fire your weapons? What we believe is that these were not the actions of reasonable, well-trained officers who used unnecessary and unjustifiable force yet again on an unarmed black man.
Steve, do you agree with that assessment? Is that what you take from the autopsy?
Well, without discussing whether the shooting was justified or in policy or whatever, I don't agree with him on what the autopsy shows. First of all, he said that all the shots were from behind. Well, that's not true. One shot was entered from the front, another one entered from the side, which is consistent with somebody facing somebody, shooting at having shot them, they start to turn and run, which is a reasonable response. And then as he ran, the rest would have been in the back. I'm not justifying that. I'm just saying I differ from their conclusions with the autopsy. But I agree with Cheryl that you fire, you know, the LAPD fires 2 and reassess, the FBI fires 3 and reassess. You fire 3, you see if you've hit the suspect. I don't necessarily agree that there's enough evidence right now to say that they weren't in fear for their lives. I don't know what they saw. I'm not saying that they were. I'm just saying that I don't have enough evidence right now to go either way.
So, Cheryl, why do you believe that they couldn't have been in fear for their lives?
Well, it's unreasonable. And listen, police officers have learned time and time again after Mike Brown and Sam DuBose and a host of others who've been shot, that now all you really have to say is, I was in fear for my life. I was in fear for my safety. And that in and of itself is sufficient. What needs to happen is officers should be required to articulate why. What happened after the first 2 rounds that still scared you? What happened after rounds 5, 6, 7, 8 that still frightened you? You're taught and trained to fire 2 rounds to stop the threat, to use that force that is reasonably necessary to overcome resistance. And once you've overcome that resistance, then you don't get to continue to use force.
As you talk about using, you know, 2 shots, pausing, assessing, you said 3, I think I was right. Yeah. You know, people are saying this was a training issue, but there are others who see this differently, like Charles Blow, who writes for the New York Times. I want to read what he said as he summed up what happened here. He says, and he also talks about not just the shooting, but also the aftermath and the protests we've seen. Each protest is undoubtedly about the case at hand, but collectively, they are also about communities that feel abused and betrayed in a country that sees them as expendable. It is not a local matter, as the White House suggested last week, but a national disgrace. So as far as Charles Blow is concerned, this is not about training. This is about something deeper. This is about the way minorities, black people, black men are seen. Cheryl, would you go as far as Charles Blow takes it in saying that they're seen as expendable?
Absolutely. And listen, we're only talking about those things that make national news. There are many other cases where there isn't a loss of life, but certainly great bodily harm has been inflicted on someone who looks like me by an officer who's drunk with power, overzealous and out of control, and there's no accountability, there's no responsible substantive discipline, consequence for when that happens. And so when the White House says this is a local matter, what they're saying is this is a black matter, and since I don't look like you, black people, it's not important to me. It's a national matter, and it needs to be addressed as such. Great bodily injury, as well as deadly force incidents. There needs to be accountability on the part of the officers. When they are held responsible personally, this stuff will stop yesterday.
Steve, is this, in your view, a training issue, or is there more to it? Do you see where Charles Blow is, do you agree where Charles Blow is taking this, saying that this is about fundamentally seeing black people as expendable?
I believe that there is a perception, that a nationwide perception in communities of color, that that's how police see them. And I believe that there are some policemen who, you know, not everybody is good at what they do or should be doing what they do. But I agree with him in that while this may be an incident in Sacramento, where these two officers were trained in Sacramento, and this may be an issue with the department, you cannot treat an individual incident in America anymore as just something floating on its own. There is a huge distrust of law enforcement by a great group of society, and you can't ignore it.
And do you believe that mistrust is justified?
In some cases, yes, it is. I think that once the mistrust starts, then there is going to be distrust no matter what happens. So what that does is it paints everybody with a broad brush. I am not saying that what happened in Sacramento was a justified shooting. But whether it is or isn't, I think that there is going to be people who at the outset believe it's probably bad, and it's because they have seen so many bad shoots that nobody's done anything about.
And Cheryl, to that point, black people are wondering why it is that police officers are rarely charged and even more rarely convicted when it comes to a loss of life, and where the victim is black, is a minority.
And so to that I say, because great deference is given to a police officer's version, we're the authority figure, and people by and large want to believe that when we say a thing, it's true. And what we are being shown now is that oftentimes, sometimes it's not true. Walter Scott, 8 rounds in the back. The officer had a version, but for that video cell phone, Michael Schlager would not be in prison right now. And so this is not our perception, this is a fact. This is what we deal with day in and day out. And so, again, back to the accountability. As long as you have a police chief who's willing to circle the wagons and say, I think I could tell you a few reasons why officers might mute their body cam. Well, I can't tell you one. I'm a supervisor, and if I was working for officers who did that, it would be a problem for them. I can't tell you that I understand why an officer would be fearful of somebody because they're black and big and hairy and scary, if that's what you think. If you're afraid, if you come to this job occupation with bias, then maybe this is not the job for you. And so maybe they were scared. I don't know. But if just a black man scares you, then this is not the occupation for you. And so let's admit that. Let's admit that there are people on the police department who are ill-suited, ill-tempered, and are not set for this kind of job. If I was a chef, wouldn't you expect me to know the difference between a knife and a spoon, a beef steak and a chicken breast? I don't get a do-over. I got to get it right the first time.
Steve, I want to give you the last 30 seconds. The admission that there is something wrong, is that, I mean, as you speak to your colleagues in law enforcement across, not just the FBI, but, police forces, that admission that there's something wrong and something needs to change, is that there?
Yes, there is a problem. There is a problem. What I am saying is that it is a group of officers, as Cheryl said, who are in the wrong business. It is a small minority, I believe, of law enforcement officers nationwide.
Be that as it may, lives are being lost. So
Absolutely.
Is there the conversation happening internally? Do you see officers wanting to have
If it's not happening internally, we are headed for a shipwreck as a country. It has to be discussed. It has to be realized. It has to be accepted and owned by law enforcement that they have an issue, and they can't continue policing in the way that we've done.
Stephen Marshall, Dorsey, thank you. Thank you for the honesty. We appreciate it. Great conversation.